Welcome to your deep dive. Ever find yourself looking at a map, maybe you're moving troops around, and you're wondering, is there like a magic number, to win this thing?
Right, right.
Well, today, we're going to tackle that question
Yeah,
with, one of history's heavyweight strategists, Carl von Clausewitz.
of course. The man, the myth, the legend.
Exactly. We're diving into his, masterpiece, it's got to
Yeah.
be said, On War, specifically Book 3, Chapter 8. And in this chapter, he really breaks down the role of numbers in warfare.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating because, I mean, we all have that gut instinct, right? That more is always better, especially when we're talking about, troops on the ground.
Oh, absolutely.
But Clausewitz, he pushes us to think beyond just, simple addition. It's not just about how many soldiers you have. It's how that number plays into your strategy, your big picture plan.
Right, because it's like that old saying, strategy without tactics, that's just the slowest route to victory. But tactics without strategy, that's just the noise before defeat.
Ooh, I
Yeah.
like that.
And that's what Clausewitz is getting at here. He's reminding us that strategy, that sets the terms. It's the where, the when, and how many troops are involved. Tactics, that's how you actually execute that vision, on the ground.
Right. It's the difference between having a plan and knowing how to fight, and you need both, right?
Absolutely. You got to have both. And that's an important distinction we got to keep in mind where, going through this chapter. It's not enough to just throw more soldiers at a problem. You have to know how those numbers fit into the bigger picture.
100%.
And Clausewitz, he's not afraid to challenge some assumptions. Like, he points to those legendary battles, the ones where a much smaller force wins.
David and Goliath, yeah.
Exactly, David and Goliath. Or the Greeks at Marathon. He basically says, look, don't bet on being a military miracle worker. Those are the exceptions, not the rule.
He's saying don't bank on that. It's not a sound strategy. Yeah. And he argued that in 19th century European warfare, those kinds of lopsided victories, they were way less common. He uses examples that his audience would be more familiar with, like Frederick the Great's victories at Leuthen and Rosbach. And in both of those, Frederick was actually outnumbered, but he used, well, some might say brilliant tactics to secure the win.
Yeah, so it sounds like having, a strategic mastermind, a genius general, can help even the odds, but it's not a guarantee.
Exactly. And actually, Clausewitz argues that if you're going up against an enemy that has double your numbers,
Oh, wow.
yeah, he says your chances of winning, they're slim, even with a brilliant leader.
Wow.
He uses examples like the battles of Kolin and Leipzig just to drive this point home.
So he's not saying it's impossible to win when you're outnumbered, but
It's a tall order, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
And, this goes back to what Clausewitz is really trying to get us to understand. He's pushing back against this idea that warfare is just a simple numbers game.
Right. It's not as easy as just lining up all your toy soldiers and seeing who has more.
Exactly. And in fact, he criticizes military historians who spend too much time focusing on things like terrain and logistics, but kind of gloss over the critical factor of numerical strength.
So he's not saying those things aren't important, but you can't ignore the numbers when you're talking about the likelihood of success in battle.
Exactly. You got to factor it in.
Right.
And this leads us to one of Clausewitz's most important concepts.
Yeah.
Relative superiority.
Okay, now this where it gets really interesting. What exactly do we mean when we say relative superiority?
So imagine this. It's not about having, more troops in total, but having the advantage right where it counts, like at the most important spot in the battle.
So you're saying it's about concentrating your forces where they'll have that, knockout punch, even if it means maybe giving a little ground somewhere else.
You got it. Clausewitz, he uses this analogy of a lever and a fulcrum, right?
Yeah.
You want to put your weight, your force, where it'll have the most leverage to move that heavy object.
Right, I see.
But to do that, to find that point, you need to really know the battlefield,
Yeah.
Where are your enemy's weak spots? What are your strengths?
So it's more than just raw power. It's knowing when and where to apply it. And speaking of timing, Clausewitz, he really emphasizes time and space in warfare, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He even calls them the daily bread of strategy. Getting those wrong, that can be disastrous.
Highly so.
But, and here's where it gets even more interesting, he warns us about oversimplifying things.
You mean it's not enough to just, be a master of military logistics, moving your troops around like clockwork?
Exactly. Clausewitz says those brilliant commanders think, Frederick the Great or Napoleon.
Titans.
Right. They weren't successful just because they could get their armies from point A to point B on time. There was more to it.
Had to be. So what was their secret?
Well, Clausewitz says it was a few things, really. One, they could size up their opponents. Strengths, weaknesses, they could see it. Two, they weren't afraid to make a bold move, a risky decision. And maybe most important, they knew how to inspire their troops.
So it's that blend of strategic genius, a dash of calculated risk, and that ability to rally your soldiers to the cause.
Nailed it.
Yeah.
And that adaptability. To make a decision, a fast one, when things change, that's just as important now in modern warfare as it was back then.
I bet. So after all of this, what's the Clausewitz takeaway here? When it comes to numbers in warfare, what are we learning?
Well, if we had to, sum it up, what's Clausewitz really saying? I think he'd tell us, all right, go for the numbers always.
Yeah.
Enter the fight, bring everything you've got.
Yeah.
But, and this is key, don't think for a second that just because you've got the bigger battalion, you've already won.
Right, don't get cocky, right? Numbers alone, those don't win wars.
100%. He'd want us to really focus on that decisive point, that place, that time where your strengths can really shine. That's where you got to hit them.
And to do that, you've got to plan it out strategically, but also be ready to adapt your tactics on the fly.
You got it. Think smart, think fast. You've got to be adaptable. You can't rely on brute force alone.
Yeah, definitely not.
Huh.
So to wrap this all up, Clausewitz, I think, really wants us to remember winning a war. It's more than just having the most boots on the ground.
It's bigger than that.
You've got to understand the why, the what, the where. What are your goals? How are you going to use everything at your disposal, your soldiers included, to reach those goals?
Exactly.
You got to fight the right battle at the right time and in the right way. There's a lot to think about here.
There really is. It shows you how complex war really is. It's not simple at all.
Not even close. But that's what makes Clausewitz's work so relevant, even now. He forces you to think, to really look at the whole picture, all the pieces in play. You got your numbers, you've got your strategy, and you can never forget about the human element in all of this.
It's true. And, this gets me thinking, Clausewitz, he was writing back in the 19th century, right? Focused on traditional warfare.
Right.
But these ideas he's talking about, this numerical superiority and relative strength, how do you think that applies to how we fight wars now? I mean, think about it. Air power, cyber warfare, we've got drones now. It's a whole new game.
That's a really interesting question, because it does seem like the basics, they're still there, right? Well, whether it's troops on the ground or, like you said, controlling the skies, it's about using your strengths at the right moment.
It all comes back to that, doesn't it?
Seems like it.
And as technology changes, as the battlefields change, Clausewitz's work, especially the parts about being adaptable, that strategic thinking, and remembering the human cost of war, I think those are always going to be important for those who lead and those who serve.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Some really wise words from a true master of military strategy. Hey, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the mind of Carl von Clausewitz. Until next time, everybody, keep those strategic minds sharp.